In tonight's top stories, all eyes are on the state budget as WA's debt increases. Special report tonight. Good evening. We begin with this week's top story. WA Treasurer Troy Buswell handed down the state budget for this financial year. The Treasurer has forecasted a 3.25% economic growth for the state, but there will be tax increases, including a rise on private vehicle registration fees. Martin Wilson reports on the state's winners and losers.
This week, WA Treasurer Troy Buswell delivered his first state budget for the second term of the Barnett government.
The budget responds to our changing economic circumstances, to the unprecedented demand for services and infrastructure, and to the imbalance that has emerged between the growth in the state's expenditure and the state's revenues. An imbalance that in large part is due to the strong population growth we're experiencing, coupled with Western Australia's historically low share of national GST revenue.
In the budget, the government will invest $7.2 billion for health, $4.4 billion for education, and $2.6 billion for law and order. $5.7 billion will be spent on public transport projects, including the Max Light Rail, Airport Rail, and the Perth to Darwin Highway, but the projects won't be complete until 2019. Meanwhile, private vehicle concession fees will be halved starting January next year. Electricity prices will go up 4% this year, water prices will go up by 6%. Revenue measures will include a 12.5% increase in land tax rates. Children of 457 visa holders attending public schools will pay an extra $4,000 per child's tuition fee. WA will still have $386 million in surplus forecast this year. Net debt will rise to $28.4 billion. Borrowing will continue to support infrastructure upgrades to parallel the increasing population needs. After the budget was tabled, Labor opposition leader Mark McGowan criticised Premier Colin Barnett of breaking numerous election promises.
Only Mr Barnett could cut services whilst at the same time increasing debt, increasing charges and increasing taxes on West Australian families. Mr Barnett has allowed the debt monster in Western Australia to get out of control.
Martin Wilson, WAMN News.
Several social groups have expressed their views over this year's state budget. Here is a summary of what they said.
This is a budget of savage cuts to the public sector workforce and privatisation, and that is only going to result in lower services for the WA public.
Today's budget is really about cuts and more cuts for the public sector workers of Western Australia. It's also about higher fees and charges for ordinary West Australians.
Well, the land tax increase of 12.5% is a kick in the shins to property investors who provide the majority of residential housing in Western Australia. That tax will affect ongoing investment in residential property.
The government has chosen to go to the business community to compensate, to make up for that loss in revenue from GST. And the problem is that WA is a high-cost place in which to do business. Well, that high cost remains. There's not much relief there for most businesses in this budget.
Today's budget will be welcomed by new home buyers who will receive a $3,000 increase in their first homeowners grant from the 15th of September, making the total grant for those who build a new home $10,000.
This budget is about dismantling the public services and selling them off. What we see here is a clear process where the government are not going to be doing a range of services and improvements to the community that were planned. Those are no longer on the table.
The state budget today, I think, has demonstrated a responsible approach to raising revenue so that we can invest back in those services. Unfortunately, what it doesn't do is address the number one issue for those people in the community who are struggling, which is the lack of access to affordable housing.
A $2 flat fee for parking will be implemented across the Transperth train station car parks. The policy will begin from July next year, with the average commuter paying approximately $460 extra a year to park at the train stations. The announcement was made only one day after the WA state budget. WA opposition leader Mark McGowan has criticised the move.
This budget has been a disaster for ordinary families in relation to cost of living pressures. It's been a disaster for future years in terms of debt increases, and at the same time they've broken many promises.
WA Treasurer and Transport Minister Troy Buswell doesn't believe that the fee will disencourage people to use public transport.
We think the transition to paid parking is something that's important in terms of getting a good balance between the subsidy that the taxpayer pays to support public transport, an important subsidy, and what transport users pay. Our anticipation is that the $2 will apply right across the network.
WAMN News understands that the public transport fares will also increase by 20% over the next 4 years.
The review into the Banksia Hill Detention Centre riot, which happened in January this year, was tabled at the State Parliament this week. The review has identified major issues including staff shortages at the centre, along with 35 other recommendations put forward by the inspector.
The riot happened on the evening of 20th January 2013, damaging cells and living areas in the detention centre and causing $400,000 worth of damages. 35 recommendations were put forward, including staff-level reviews, reducing lockdown hours, introducing a positive rehabilitation program, and ensuring effective air conditioning. In the report, Inspector Neil Morgan said the damages caused by the detainees were unacceptable and highlighted that many people were traumatized, including detainees as well as the staff. However, the report also said detainees didn't violently target staff or other detainees during the incident. The Labour opposition accused the government of making the wrong decision in merging Rangeview with Banksia Hill Detention Centre.
The Barnett government made the decision to shut Rangeview Remand Centre, shut one of only 2 juvenile detention centres in the state, and cram juveniles on remand and short-term incarceration in with long-term sentenced juveniles. It undermined juvenile detention, and it was done as a cheap way of fulfilling their election promise to build a young men's prison.
Meanwhile, the Community and Public Sector Union WA Secretary Tony Walkington called on the state government to ensure that the recommendations in the report will be well funded to improve the situation.
There are many recommendations in this report that require considerable and significant work. We'd support the department in doing that work, but we are concerned that the department will be required to undertake significant changes whilst also identifying considerable savings. And in order to address these recommendations, we'll need to reduce services in other sections.
Timothy Seow, WAMN News.
In wake of last week's amalgamations plans announced by Premier Colin Barnett and Minister Tony Simpson, many residents in Fremantle were outraged that their local council will be merged with Melville. This week I caught up with Fremantle Mayor Dr Brad Pettitt to further discuss this issue. Brad Pettitt, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you for having me.
Looking at this sort of situation given out by the state government, how concerned were you?
Around the amalgamations question, we are very concerned, just in the sense of what we're really concerned about is losing Fremantle's identity and also losing that focus on revitalising Fremantle as an urban centre.
Do you think the other territories are simply too big as well to actually outline?
I think they are. I think, look, there is a good middle ground here. We all support that there should be local government reform and that there should actually be less local governments. So we certainly support the Premier on that. What we don't support is this idea where we just stretch in these long, thin local government areas where you have communities from Willetton to Fremantle which have very little in common, albeit from Belmont to Kalamunda. There's got to be much more around activity centres. This reform process needs to be linked back to the government's own planning document, Directions 2031, rather than sitting entirely separate and almost in contradiction to that.
Do you think it will be too big for the councils to manage that sort of area which this goes ahead?
Well, look, I think you can manage them. I just don't think you can do it well. You can, for example, can you imagine a city of Melmountle or Freeville, whatever we're going to call it, actually putting all this money that we do into festivals in Fremantle all year round, and doing those really things that make Fremantle a special place? I actually think you're in danger of losing those really great things that make places, and you end up with the councils that just look at roads and rates and not much else.
Do you think people in Fremantle care about it?
Absolutely. In fact, there is a huge, passionate groundswell support for Fremantle people wanting to keep Fremantle as a unique community and unique centre of its own. So there was going to be a range of protests and a range of really ways of trying to lobby government and over the next few months. But council will also be putting together a really factual, evidence-based approach as to why we can have a bigger Fremantle, but not one that stretches all the way to the other side of the freeway.
What do you urge the residents to do? Are there anything they want
get involved, make their voices heard, write to the Minister, write to the Premier, let them know they're not happy and that they want a real Fremantle boundary, not some sprawling suburbs.
Brad Pettitt, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
To other news, Hong Kong's chief executive CY Leung's popularity has dropped again, according to recent polls by the Hong Kong University Public Opinion Programme.
The latest poll by Hong Kong University's Public Opinion Programme showed that Mr. Leung's approval rating had dropped to 45.1%, the lowest since he took office. The figure shows that only 29% of the public would choose him to be Hong Kong chief executive, while the 18th to 29th age group strongly disliked Mr. Leung. The survey was done in late July when the Secretary for Development, Paul Chan, was allegedly involved in the conflict of interest toward the land dealings in Kwu Tung. Some analysts believe that the case may have triggered the decline in Mr. Leung's approval ratings. Aaron Key, Warm News.
And that's how the world looks tonight. Thanks for joining us.
More news on our website. Good evening.
Good night.